Welcome to Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast, where we meet experts from all walks of life to learn their intrinsic motivation so that they can share it with the world. What do we have in store today? Stay tuned.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everybody out there in podcast land. You are in tune to another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I'm David.
And today, folks, I think we have another one. There's a lot of us that we were on, I guess, the other side of the veil, maybe. And we were very, I want to see it. I want proof. I want to touch it. I want to feel it. I want to see it. And we had a lot of skepticism. And we have a gentleman today, 30 years, folks, 30 years he worked at the South Florida Sentinel, Sun Sentinel. And so his quest was looking for accuracy, and he had a huge dose of skepticism. I mean, why not in that business? And then something happened. I'm sure we'll find out in the hour what happened. But he pierced the veil, and so he is no longer skeptical. And we want to know what happened to him to change his mind. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Kingsley Guy to the podcast. Welcome, Kingsley.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Hamza.
Yes, thanks for making the podcast. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's kind of, I mean, it sounds like movies now where you buy into that character because they're so opposite, and then at the end, it's just a 360-degree reversal. And what role would you play in this movie?
I would say, well, not 360, 180-degree reversal. I think that you start looking at it from the other side. I was, as the title of the book indicates, skeptical, piercing the veil. A skeptical journalist discovers unseen worlds. I had a very successful career in journalism. Everything was going along well. From the outside, looked great. But about 32 years ago, I discovered I had an addiction to alcohol. And the way that people often deal with that, life or death situation, is to embark on a spiritual journey. I had no concept of God, no sense of spirituality, but it was life or death. So I said, what the heck, I'm going to give this a try. And it launched me on a spiritual journey for the last 32 years, where I've experienced amazing things, seen amazing things, some of which defy the known laws of physics, experienced incredible states of consciousness. And I saw on your website you talked about coincidences or synchronicities, and enormous number of synchronicities that have directed my life and caused me to understand that, as Hamlet said, and Shakespeare's Hamlet, there's more to heaven and earth a ratio than is dreamt of in your philosophy.
I love it. And when you look back, do you think, why did I have to go through this bout of alcoholism to actually access this space of consciousness? Or did you think that was part of the plan all along?
Well, you look back with some perspective, and you can see your life unfolding. You have to have a few years behind you before you're able to do it, but you get to my age and you're able to look back and see, hey, this happened and this happened and this happened. There seemed to be an intelligent background directing all of this. So, yeah, I think, I had choices. I have free will, but yet things opened up to me that I had a choice of following or not following, and generally chose to follow it, and that led me to where I am today. So, I think, I don't know what you want to call it, fate, destiny, but I do think you also have free will as well to make the decisions that and head in the direction that you seem to be led. Mm-hmm.
Now, you said it was 30 years ago, but if you can kind of go back, because there's still some people, we have people all walks of life that listen to the podcast, and I'm just thinking if you could humor us and just talk about what was the world like before. I mean, you worked for a major newspaper. You had to deal with facts and accuracy the whole time. Mm-hmm. And what was your mindset then, and did that lead to drinking alcohol?
Well, I think there are a lot of causes for alcohol. I had a rather tumultuous childhood. I had insanity in my family, lots of alcohol in my family. Whether there's an hereditary component, I believe there is. So, but in a profession that's very skeptical, and at that point, a very hard drinking profession when I entered it. That's changed somewhat, but so, give me the facts. I was very much in the world largely of politics, and that was how I functioned, went through my career. But then, you hit that point where you have to say, wow, there's got to be something more than what I'm seeing in the material world, and that's what launched me on the spiritual journey. And I had some experiences early in my life. My mother was a suicide. I was living on the other side of the world as a student in South Korea, and that day I didn't know she had died, but I felt a presence in the room. I felt terrified, absolutely terrified, more so than I had ever been in my life. And I'm 10,000 miles away from home. And looked under the bed before I went to sleep, and out the windows, in the closet, couldn't find anything. But I shook myself to sleep, and that morning, at about 2 in the morning, I got a call from home telling me my mother had killed herself. How do you explain those things? It didn't make me a believer in ghosts or unseen worlds or anything of that nature, but it at least planted a seed, possibly, that that consciousness does survive the death of the body.
And I think this is the point where we talk about coincidences and there's no accidents, because I share. First of all, I want to share my condolences to you for your mother, and I definitely want to say that. And I think when it happened to me, I have some skill sets to kind of deal with the other side of the veil, but I still felt the same feelings that you felt. And my sister was overseas 3 years ago, living over there, and it was that unshakable feeling that I had never felt before finding out that news. So, so I definitely identify with that.
Yeah, my condolences, too.
Yeah. And so when that happened, it was, did you, like, from a few years prior when my grandmother had passed, I was in corporate, and so I was more the whole, let me see the accuracy, or let me just see visibly our two eyes. And I tried to package it like I did all the other stuff I did in corporate, and tried to go to work and say, hey, you know what, I'll deal with this on the weekend. And my body, and I guess the immaterial world, had other plans as well. How was it when you found that news? Did you try to go back to the status quo, or you knew you had to make a change?
No, I tried to go back to the status flow. Like I said, I was still a skeptic, had no concept of the spirituality. I thought, well, this is an inexplicable experience that signifies nothing. But, the psychological tolls it takes on you is immense, and you don't even know that it's taking those tolls. I then went I was in South Korea at the time. I was 19 years old at that time, but I left after a year of study and ended up in India. Crossed from, went down through Japan and the Philippines, Hong Kong, Thailand. I got to India, Calcutta, and I went from Calcutta all the way back to Cleveland, Ohio, without leaving the ground, and had some amazing experiences in India. That still skeptical, but just an incredible spiritual sense that I felt in that country that I absolutely loved, but didn't give me any belief in God or any belief in the power of the Spirit. But I was in a place called Benares, also known as Varanasi, called Varanasi today. It was called Benares, more so when I was there. That was quite a ways back. And I'm standing outside. This is the holiest city in India. I'm standing outside the Golden Temple, and I was not allowed in because I was not a Hindu. But I'm standing there amidst these throngs of people, and I had the sense it could have been 500 B.C. when the Buddha was preaching outside of Benares. Just had the sense of timelessness. I'm standing in this line next to these throng of people entering the temple, and an old woman hands me a fistful of flower petals and takes my hand and puts it into the mouth of a passing sacred cow that gobbled up the petals, and the tongue in the palm of my hand. I remember it like it was yesterday, but it just sent a jolt of electricity or something, ecstasy through me. And I was just transfixed by where I was. And I made a pledge right then. Someday I will return to this exact spot and again feed flower petals to a sacred cow. And I turned to thank the woman, and she was gone. But I remembered that pledge, and 20 years later, when I am faced with this life or death struggle with alcoholism, I made the decision then to return to that exact spot, and it was that return to India that really shifted my consciousness and led me on a spiritual journey that has taken me to many, many incredible places.
I love that. I want to unpack a lot of that. And I'm thinking you had mentioned at the top of the hour the states of consciousness. And I remember in corporate, you probably heard the simple example, when you go into a concert hall or a big meeting room, you could feel that energy, if it's cold, if it's warm, if you're going to have a good meeting or not. And it sounds like you felt it on a greater level in India. And do you think it was because of the awareness, or it wasn't in your awareness at the time, but do you think looking back now or even today, you can go into different places and feel that state of consciousness that will deny or confirm you should stay there or keep it moving?
Oh, absolutely. There's in certain locations, certain places that I've been to, certain cathedrals that just have taken me into sense of deja vu and sense of just incredible feelings as well. That this is a special place. You've had been to Egypt a couple of times. Wrote a novel called Queen of the Heavens. Set in ancient Egypt, and sites in Egypt that I've been have just transported me into feelings of something special about these places that has a profound impact on you. And I found that in Egypt. I found it in India. I found it in places in the United States as well. Oh, definitely. There's an energy in certain locations that just can transport you into a different sense of consciousness, no doubt about it. And India is one of those places. It's unlike any other country. My first sight of India was in 1967. I landed in Calcutta during a time of famine, where you literally had dead people lying in the streets. But yet I could still sense a palpable spiritual sense in that country that is like no other country that I've ever been to, even Egypt. But the sense of ancient Egypt, standing amidst some of the ruins, just a transformative experience.
When you were in Calcutta and you said it was the death in the streets, do you think that, or do you believe that is why you felt, you're so close to the veil there. It's very transitory there at the time that you had gone. Would you look at that as a accelerant to your awareness?
Yes, absolutely. I went from there, and all this I deal with in the book, but I went from there up into the Himalayas, into Darjeeling, where I was able to look out at the sky, or what they call the snows, the peaks of the Himalayas. But I got up there, and it was a wonderful, wonderful city. And not many Westerners were in Calcutta or Darjeeling at that point. It has become, particularly Darjeeling, lots of tourists and such, but not when I was there. But I was fogged in I was going to be there for 5 days, and I was fogged in for 4 of them. And the night before I was to leave, evening before I was to leave, I went to the promontory that overlooked the mountains and just sitting in a cloud. But just before the sunset, the clouds started to lift, and it's almost like the veil lifted. The clouds lifted, and the air became crystal clear just in a matter of 15, 20 minutes, and I was able to look out at the mountains and feel that sense of awe and wonder. From there, I went down to Benares, where I had that experience that I mentioned with the sacred cow and the old woman, and just feelings that I had never experienced before At this point, I was only 20 years old, so I didn't have a lot of experiences. But I'd never felt some of what I felt when in that trip through India.
Kingsley, so during all this time, was there one experience that you had that really pretty much got rid of all the skepticism? Because I know, like for myself, when I was younger, I was having different experiences, and you keep looking for reasons why this happened, or why you had this experience, trying to justify it. But at some point in time, you just got to throw your hands in the air and say, you know what, there's a lot going on in this world that I don't know about. You know, there's other dimensions, other things going on, and I'm just going to kind of enjoy discovering. But you kind of just throw your hands in the air and say, you know, I don't know everything, and that's all right.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so for you, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I 20 years, I mentioned after that experience in India where I pledged to go back and feed flower petals to a sacred cow. 20 years later, that's when I discovered my alcoholism and started on my spiritual journey. So I said, okay, it's time for me to go back. And I'm feeling a sense of reading all the Eastern literature, Christianity, the Bible, the Quran. I'm gobbling up as much religious understanding as I could, and I'm feeling a very, very strong sense that, hey, I'm on my way. So I'm 6 months sober, and I fly over to Bombay, and I see the sights of India, which can be pretty tough. The poverty, the people without limbs, lost from leprosy, and shanty towns, just unbelievable poverty. And my spiritual sense left me. Like, how could a loving God allow such poverty to exist? And I got to Benares, and I still having all those feelings of boy, I'm going through a dark night of the soul, and really questioning everything about God. And my newly found spirituality just virtually vanished. And I go to feed the flower petals to a sacred cow one night in Benares, and I'm not feeling anything. I'd hoped to reignite that feeling that I had 20 years earlier. So I go down to the Ganges, and I said, I'll meditate. I'm meditating on a bench, and I feel a bump behind me, and I turn around, and here's a leper, no arms, his nose just eaten up by leprosy. And I just looked at that, and there's thousands of people around me who think this is the most sacred place on earth. Funeral pyres burning, people's ashes being thrown in the Ganges, and I'm just looking at this site and just shattered and saying, oh my God, there can't be a God. And I go down to the river, and I said, I'm going to float a devotional candle in the river. And it's a candle put on a little plate of leaves, dried leaves. And some women ahead of me put their candles in the river and splashed their hands. And the candles went out several paces away. There's a clutch of about 8 candles out there. I put my candle in the river, and I splash my hands. And my candle goes out about 3 feet. The current catches it and starts sending it back to shore. And I had this thought at that point, my God, I've come halfway around the world to have a spiritual experience, and I can't even float a candle on the Ganges properly. And it was at that exact moment of my despair that a 3-inch frog surfaced from the muddy Ganges, grabbed the plate of my candle and its left front leg, and swam it out where it deposited it in the middle of the other candles, where it burned more brightly than all the rest. And I was a baptized Catholic, hadn't been to church in years, but dipped my hand in the Ganges and genuflected. It was all I could think to do. And walked back to my dwelling, past the funeral pyres, and just said, I'm on the right track. Let's follow this wherever it goes. So if there was one incident, that was it, with that frog in the Ganges. Now, people might say, okay, well, that was just a coincidence. Well, 28 years later, just to continue the story, I'm sitting in meditation, and I get this message from in my meditation: visit the graves of your paternal grandparents. It's a strong message. Couldn't get it out of my mind. And I said, well, I'm not going to fly to Cleveland to do that, but next time I'm in Cleveland, I'll do it. I hadn't been to the gravesite in 50 years. But a few months later, I find myself in Cleveland. I go to the gravesite. I have flowers I'm going to put down, and I look at the tombstone, and there's flat to the ground. There's a leaf, I thought, and I stoop down to brush it away, and off hops a tree frog and disappears in the grass. And that, all I could say at that point, okay, now I know when I got this message. But that launched me on another investigation into psychic awareness that took me to seances and visiting mediums and such, and enormous, incredible experiences in that. So the frog has shown up a couple times in my life. These are the stories I relate in my book. Mm-hmm. Hello?
I thought David was jumping in there on that one.
Uh-huh.
Oh, no, go ahead. I was waiting for you. I'm sorry. No, amazing. Problem. Amazing stories, yeah.
Yeah.
It is amazing. And Kingsley, I do want to, I'm looking at some parallels here. So when you were talking about drinking alcohol, and you're talking about states of consciousness earlier, and you're talking about I need to actually go somewhere. Do you feel that's more of a Western thing of we're gonna achieve that nirvana or that bliss if we actually physically go somewhere? That's kind of the basic teaching over here in the West.
Yeah, I think of certain ideas from Eastern thinking. For instance, in Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching, there's a basic text of Taoism. One needn't leave his home, and he may know the world. Which so your states of consciousness, you can enter amazing states of consciousness right where you are. Now, you're talking about going someplace. One of the people I deal with in the book, as a matter of fact, his daughter, wrote the foreword for the book, but it was the late Apollo astronaut, Edgar Mitchell, who I knew, had some amazing discussions with in the course of over the years. And coming back from the moon, after walking, he was the sixth man to walk on the moon. Coming back in Apollo 14, he entered what is known in Sanskrit as a state of samadhi, kind of a rough equivalent to nirvana in Buddhism, but a state of samadhi. And he got back to Earth, and he was an MIT scientist. He a pilot, Navy pilot. He wasn't a mystic, but he entered this state as kind of a state of connectedness with all things, accompanied by ecstasy, where that veil between your individual consciousness and cosmic consciousness disappears. And I had experienced the same state after spending 2 weeks in an ashram up in New York State, going through a lot of ceremonies with Brahmin priests and meditating, and got back to Fort Lauderdale and entered the state for about 4 hours. And it was the most amazing state I've ever been. You cannot look at existence the same after you have been in it. And Edgar, Dr. Mitchell, wanted to find out the scientific reasons for this. He's a scientist, so he starts investigating the the scientific foundations of spiritual experiences, going into quantum physics and such things as that. Established an institute for the study of this. And we had some amazing discussions because we had this shared experience of samadhi. But so he went to the moon to find it on his return visit. I went to an ashram in New York, but it's very much an internal thing. You don't have to go to the moon to get there. You don't have to go to an ashram to get there. But it doesn't happen often. It hasn't happened to me again. But it just having spent 4 hours in this state, it just totally changes your the way you look at life, death, the cosmos. I've been to different places in the world and had these feelings, but I've also experienced them through spiritual practices as well, back here in the United States.
Yeah, you're saying a lot of that to the chagrin of travel agents because they were licking their chops about a lot of travel people were going to do to reach samadhi.
There's no guarantees on that. I don't think Edgar Mitchell ever expected it when he was. I know he didn't expect it when he come back from the moon. It's interesting. The first time I met him, I'm doing a mutual friend knew him, and he had come out with a book. So I said, I think I'll do a story for my newspaper. So I'm sitting in his study up in Jupiter, Florida, a little north of here, and he hands me something that looked like a joystick to a cheap computer game. And he said, "That's the control stick of the lunar lander." Oh my God. I guess he and his partner Alan Shepard, they were sending the lunar lander to crash back into the moon, so they just cannibalized it for a few souvenirs, and he got the control stick. So it's a pretty amazing feeling holding something in my hand that's been to the moon and back.
Oh, man, and while you're talking, I'm looking at Google Flights, and there's no flights to the moon, so darn it.
Well, wait until Elon Musk gets going. He might get something up there. He might not be able to afford the $10 million he'll charge or $20 million, but he'll probably...
That's just to get on the rocket. Right. So we're kind of playing tongue-in-cheek with the whole travel, and I'm glad you highlighted that state of consciousness. And I want to get your opinion on this, because you said this happened in the 80s where you were dealing with alcohol, and in a way it is a way, alcohol is known as a spirit, and so most people do that as an escape because they're thinking, okay, there's something else out there, or is this all there is? And so if we could fill in the blank and take out alcohol today, especially in the state of Florida, you would say opioids. And why is that so high? Is that because there is some level of escapism? Like, is that all there is to life? There has to be more, and we're looking for that outlet.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. The reason for that, absolutely. Now, I go back to the 60s. I went to school during the 60s, and of course I was out of the country for a good part of the craziness of that. But looking for the LSD and marijuana and such, mushrooms change your state of consciousness, but you don't need it, and there's spiritual practices. I've been stone cold sober for 32 years, and I've had these experiences while sober. But you're absolutely right. I think people are looking for escape. The question of, is this all there is? And for a short time anyway, through external means, you're able to experience that. Now, some people, Aldous Huxley being one, The Doors of Perception, in his book, I think he notes that the brain is not where we develop all these ideas, but the brain is a filtering mechanism. And what you need to do is realize that, and I think through meditation and such, you quiet the mind somewhat, and so all of these stimuli are able to enter you that would not otherwise. For instance, there is so much going on around us. If we could see microwaves, we wouldn't be able to see across the street. If we could see them, but we can't see them. Sounds, there are sounds on the dogs can hear that we can't hear. Vision, eagle can see the way we can't see. So we are surrounded by all sorts of stimuli that if we let them in, you would have a different perspective of existence. And I think that's the purpose of spiritual practices. These stimuli can enter you that they might not otherwise enter otherwise. So, and there's techniques to get there, breathing techniques, meditation techniques, what I went through in the ashram. Lots going on that we don't know about, and that maybe we'll learn about someday. I think we're uncovering things and having some concepts of the laws of physics that we didn't have just 10, 15, 20 years ago that are opening the possibilities of the existence of different dimensions. String theory, for instance, posits about 10 or 11 different dimensions. What if we could access those dimensions? If, in fact, string theory, there's something to string theory. What if we could access those dimensions? What would our existence look like? It'd be quite different, I think, than what we're able to perceive today. It's exciting.
It's really encouraging. It's a very exciting time, and that, the whole 360 degrees where things that happened in the past are being revisited. You do hear about Silicon Valley microdosing on psilocybin to access those other states of awareness. Mm-hmm. And so there is some image or some glimpse of the 60s and 2.0, how we're going to do it differently. Yep. And what I saw that was really interesting yesterday, shout out to all the college football fans, because we're right back in the throes of college sports or college mm-hmm. football. And NFL starts today. But in the news after the game yesterday, they were highlighting how they were talking about the big hurricane that just passed Dorian, and they were saying that with this 5G technology, you will not be able to detect the hurricane patterns, because that 5G is tapping into different realms that is obstructing what we currently see in the third dimension. Are you following any of that from I'm trying to be balanced, not all in of, 5G's the devil, to, mm-hmm. Like you were saying, being accurate and having some sense of objectiveness. What's your take on it?
I haven't really been following that, but one of the things in the acknowledgments, I quote Thomas Edison, and he says basically, people say I created things, and he said, no, I really never created anything. I just got these impressions from outside of me and put things together. So as we move forward in our science, I think there's a lot of things that are going to be rather amazing and open us up to different ways of thinking. For instance, the telescope. Before Galileo focused on the moons of Jupiter, our whole idea of the cosmos was somewhat different than it is. What did radio do? Changed our perception so much. Television, the computer age, changing the way we look at things. The science is happening so fast that sometimes you worry it's getting ahead of us, but it is also opening the doors to enormous potential and also enormous issues and problems that sometimes we rush too quickly into things without really realizing what the consequences are going to be. 5G, it's going to speed things up even faster than they are right now. So
yes,
things
indeed.
are moving quick.
Yeah. How much faster can it go, right?
That's one reason I think it's important to have a meditation practice. Slow things down for you. And we become so addicted almost to external stimuli. I was addicted to alcohol to escape, but external stimuli that people addicted to. Internet addiction or whatever, addiction to all sorts of things that we're facing now that we didn't have to face just 25, 30 years ago. Cell phone. I think of when I crossed Asia. I'd find myself in the middle of India or Afghanistan or Iran, and nobody knew where I was, and I didn't have any way to contact anybody. I could maybe find a phone and figure out how to make an international call, but I didn't have any money. I'd just leave in the morning, and nobody knew where I was. I could have ended up dying in Afghanistan. Nobody would have known a thing. But now we're in constant contact with our cell phones anywhere in the world. So it's just quite a difference. So one of the things when I first crossed Asia in the 60s. You got into the third world, everybody used abacuses. everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I went the second time, 20 years later, nobody used abacuses. They were all using handheld calculators. So, the changes that just took place in those 20 years, just phenomenal, and they're coming faster and faster and faster.
And I'm actually sitting on my hands here because it hasn't reached the States yet, but they have that new movie, The Current War. And are you familiar with that movie where they're talking about the battle with Edison, Westinghouse, and Tesla?
I am not, but I am a little familiar. I'm somewhat familiar with Edison, Westinghouse, and Tesla and the battle between AC and DC current and such. Just a fascinating battle. And, of course, Tesla, one of just finally, because Elon Musk named a car after him, I think is getting some of the credit that he didn't get earlier in the century. But an amazing man with some ideas of how to tap into power sources without power lines or burning of fossil fuels. Just an amazing man. And we're seeing so much change coming in that respect right now as well.
So let me ask you, Kingsley, as you were having your experiences and going and coming to new truths and realizations, how was that affecting the relationships with those around you? Like I can imagine maybe when you were still, a journalist and in that skepticism mode, maybe your circle of friends were a certain kind of people, and then as you started, traveling the world and having experiences, and did that change your relationships with those that, you were close to?
Yeah, and one of those things that in the newspaper, I didn't speak much about any of this. I'm not going to go into the editor's office and say, hey, I'm heading up to New York to an ashram where I'm going to meditate and chant and go through ceremonies with Brahmin priests. I didn't this was all done under the radar. That's not secretly, but under the radar. I just not something that you would talk about, or not something that most people in the newsroom could relate to. I'd only share it with my friends outside of the profession. And the reason for that, my name was on the masthead of a major daily newspaper, and you have to take into consideration perceptions that people might have of you. But I've been out of the newspaper business full-time for a number of years now, and I wrote a column for 8 years, but I haven't done that for the last 6 years. So my book is in itself, I'm at that point in life where, okay, I don't have to impress anyone. I don't have to I don't have to hide who I am from anyone. I can come out and write about this, and in doing so, I hope to get other people talking about the experiences that they have had that they may have been reluctant to talk about for fear of ridicule, or even fear that they might have been going crazy. Well, no, these things happen. These synchronicities happen. Start noticing them. Start talking about them. Don't be ashamed of your spiritual journey and your spiritual experiences and adventures. I'd like to see greater dialogue going on the subjects that we've been talking about today. So at this point, I'm not worried about anything really. I have a nice condominium down in Fort Lauderdale. I'm doing okay. But I think it's time to just let it all hang out, let's say. And this is who I am. This is what I've experienced. And if you can relate to it, great. If you can't, that's fine too. But I feel a journalistic obligation to report these amazing experiences that I've had.
And Kingsley, we couldn't have set up a better segue about the rabbit hole. So when you had talked about going to the ashram and such, you had garnered an interest in seances and mediums. What was the original insight into doing that, and do you have a different opinion today?
Yeah, I mentioned the frog on my grandparents' gravestone, and I said to myself, okay, there's obviously a message here, but what is that message? And how am I going to find out? And I said, okay, well, I'm very skeptical about mediums and psychics and such, but I'm gonna explore that. And you're from Orlando. You may have heard of the city of Cassadaga, or the spiritual center of Cassadaga. I went up there and had a couple readings that were just absolutely spot on, and I deal with those in the book. That got me exploring physical mediumship, in which in the seances you get levitations, you get things flying around the room, you get appearances of ectoplasm from the medium, and faces that appear in the ectoplasm and such. All of this sounds really crazy, and boy, I before would have said this is a bunch of nonsense, it's all fraud, it's all fake. But there's a place in Fort Lauderdale that I deal with these in the book. It's called the Metaphysical Chapel, which occasionally has these mediums who are pretty amazing. And there's one in particular from Germany, Kai Muge, who visited, and I visited him a couple of times, and the experiences were just so incredible, including, and this is how I end the book, and I don't want to give away everything in the book, that's how I end the book, with a physical manifestation of something, and the circumstances that related directly to me, and the circumstances surrounding that were truly amazing. And it was it was, let's say, the most mind-boggling day of my life, and I've been to several of these, but this first one just was mind-boggling. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was not late 19th, actually started in the 1840s, but up through the 1920s or so, the spiritualist movement in the United States and Europe was very, very strong, in which these seances were quite common, and a lot of skepticism. And I'm still a skeptic. I don't take anything at face value, but sometimes you get hit upside the head so often that you just have to say, hey, this is real. And did some exploration into the spiritualist movement, and certain people, you might have heard the name Alfred Russel Wallace. His name is on the Origin of Species with Charles Darwin. And he went out to study these appearances and apparitions and defiance of the law of gravity. And he concluded there was much of this that was real. Another famed scientist, Albert Crookes, he discovered thallium, invented the vacuum tube, was a member of the Royal Society. He said, I'm going to study this. And his fellow scientists said, great, Crookes is going to show that this is all nonsense. And Crookes goes out and does his scientific study and concludes, no, this isn't nonsense. And some of his work was the most detailed out there. The Russians studied it, the French studied it, the Germans studied it. There is scientific information from this earlier age from top scientists who say, no, this is true. Today, if it doesn't fit the paradigm, people are going to say, it's nonsense, it's all fraud, it's all fake. Well, no, it's not. There are frauds and there are fakes, but not all is fraudulent and not all is fake. And I think it warrants us at this point to start looking into it. There's an interesting show can be accessed on YouTube. It's called The Afterlife Investigations, and it deals with some of the things that I deal with in the book, and with these physical seances where physical things happen, and very, very interesting. I'd recommend to your listeners take a look at it. It might open some people's eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm also thinking back at that time, like you said, in the 20s, during that big wave here in the States, got to give a shout-out to the one known as Abdul. and he doesn't have any videos on YouTube, but the person that he highly influenced was what's his name? Oh my goodness, I just had his name, and I listen to him all the time. He will come back to me. Oh my goodness. But at any rate, Neville Goddard. Thank you. Oh my goodness. Okay, thanks. So Neville Goddard, and he has a ton of videos and audios and what have you that are out there. And he was talking about states of consciousness that we were talking about at the top of the hour. And he was saying, like most comedians say, everyone knows that you die. The only person that doesn't is you. And you're like, I'm dead? Oh, for real? What happened? And so you're in this other state of consciousness that you weren't aware of before, and it was like somebody had to tap you on the shoulder. And so I've been in mediumships where people wanted to speak to grandma, and maybe the dad that they didn't get along with had come along. And I wanted to know, at the time you didn't know you were on the other side of the world. You found out that your mother had transitioned. And were you using that as some type of medium, pun intended, to get in touch with her?
Yeah. Do we all have some sort of capacity in regards to that? I do believe now that the consciousness survives the death of the body. This is, in all the great religions, that is part and parcel with it. Some think it's through reincarnation that we come back. Others think that the soul progresses through other phases or levels in the spiritual world. This is, but it is a constant, and has been a constant for 5,000 years of civilization that we know of, and I'm sure before that, even before the written word. And there are studies now being done. University of Virginia, for instance, has an institute that is studying the survival of consciousness and reincarnation. It's a major university. This is being dealt with. Of course, the Hindus have known it, and Buddhists have known it, Taoists have known it for thousands and thousands of years. Their concept is that we do come back, but the soul does advance and through different lives. One of the people lives down near here is, or did anyway, Brian Weiss, Many Lives, Many Masters. He wrote this book years ago. And he was the head of psychiatry at, I think it's in Miami Beach, of Mount Sinai Hospital. And he wrote that book, we're probably going back 30 years anyway, where he would regress patients and was amazed to find that in these regressions people would enter other lives, and to him he felt that this was a very useful scientific tool, and he went out and he wrote the book. It took a lot of courage for him to do that. I mean, he was, lots of hypnotherapists who had been doing this for years, but he was the MD, head of psychiatry for a major medical institution, and you have to wonder what the eyebrows going up among his peers in the medical community. That's one reason that I wrote this book, and I developed a very good reputation as a journalist down here in South Florida, and I feel that may give the book some credibility, that because I was not a person who spent his entire life in a cave in the Himalayas writing this. I was a person who was dealing with very much the what quote real world situations, and so that's one of the reasons I felt an obligation to write this.
Yeah, I have to give a shout-out to Barbara that listens. She told me I was a big fat liar, and just like Dr. Weiss and yourself, we were living in those two worlds, and in the dating world, I was totally like that. I wouldn't go out and talk about this at all. And, 6 months later, I start liking a girl, and I start talking about this. They're like, who is this guy? Who is this guy?
Yeah. Well, you get the point in life where it doesn't matter, and I'm at that point.
Exactly. I was like, I wasted a lot of 6 months. I was a big fat liar.
You want to think I'm nuts, crazy? That's all right. It's not going to affect my life one way or the other.
I can laugh now, but at those early days, it was a challenge.
Well, I think, this podcast like yours and other shows that I think people are starting to be more inclined to talk about some of these things. And I don't think the major media is yet, but let's say the legacy media is ready to talk about it. But other media outlets certainly are. Mm-hmm.
And let me ask you, as a journalist, when we talk about past lives and traveling and reaching these states of euphoria, in many cases they are outside of the United States. You think of, like you said, India, you think of Egypt and some of these other places. And you mentioned here in the States, and we have a short mind state just probably because of how we were brought up of just thinking 1776, but this landmass was lived upon before that. And so I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the places in the United States where you had uncovered energies in your travels.
Well, certainly the Sri Muktananda City Yoga Ashram in New York, in the Catskill Mountains, South Fallsburg, New York, was just an amazing place. Transformative place. Another place was Crestone, Colorado, and I mentioned that in the book. Crestone is up about 8,000 feet. It was a site Native Americans found sacred, and is now, I think even since I was there nearly 30 years ago, it's grown as a spiritual center, but certainly some interesting, amazing things happened to me in Crestone that I deal with in the book. I, for some reason, just absolutely loved Lake Tahoe area. There's just a spiritual sense that I get in that area, and I go back there every year just to sort of renew myself and escape the South Florida heat. But it's sitting there in the Sierra Nevadas, just incredible. The redwoods of California is another place. Redwood forests of California it's almost like the trees have souls. That in the midst of those redwoods is just it was a transformative experience. The Grand Canyon, looking out at the Grand Canyon, I've been there 3 times, and it's just you realize the power of nature. And I think in this country, certainly places of natural setting are just so dramatic and so dynamic that you can't deny some special energy there. As for physical places, I mentioned Cassadaga, but there's a place up in New York, not too far from Buffalo, called Lilydale, which is the center of the spiritualist movement. Was years ago and a century ago, and still is a very powerful place that I found. You look at the Native American culture, of course, that we have, and I think people discovering the spiritual dynamics of that culture truly different from the European perspective on existence, and we're rediscovering that. And glad that we are.
Mm-hmm. It sounded like David wanted to jump in.
Mm-hmm. David?
No, I'm just enjoying listening to you. I was just going to ask you real quick, Kingsley, have you ever heard of an author by the name of Wayne Peterson, and he wrote a book called Extraordinary Times, Extraordinary Beings, Experiences of an American Diplomat. Mm-hmm. Very interesting book. Just from your story, it's something that you might like, so I thought I'd mention it.
All right. You look at extraordinary. You mentioned extraordinary beings. one of the people that I had a privilege of meeting in my journalistic career with a few other journalists over in Moscow was Mikhail Gorbachev, and I was sitting. We had about an hour and a half conversation with President Gorbachev. This was after he had left office. This was 1999. Yes. Mm-hmm. And but sitting, I'm sitting a few feet away from him, and just brilliant, absolutely brilliant man, and just a sense about him that here was an extraordinary being. And I think about that time in history where Mikhail Gorbachev and Margaret Thatcher and Pope John Paul II and Ronald Reagan and Lech Walesa came together in what eventually resulted in the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, and what was it was one of those things that caused me to ask are there things going on that shape our destiny that would bring these people together? And you can think of 1776 and the geniuses that were brought together back then, the Jeffersons and Hamiltons and Washingtons and Adams and Madisons, and you just say, boy, what would bring them together to create what they created? It gives you, I think, a different perspective, at least for me, perspective on history, and think that there may be some sort of guiding light that is helping us through some very difficult times.
Yeah, when you mentioned Gorbachev and those guys in the late 80s and the fall of the wall, there is that school of thought on this side of the veil that was the impetus for the Mandela effect.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the Mandela effect?
You're talking Nelson Mandela?
Yes.
Well, I'm familiar with him, but the Mandela effect I'm not totally not familiar with.
Sure, and it could be another rabbit hole on YouTube on a Sunday.
Okay.
But it's a school of thought in that when that wall went down, that there was a divide if we talk about quantum physics. And so there's some people that remember, Mandela either dying in jail or Mandela being released in jail. And a lot of that was around that time, and where people have two different memories, like, you don't remember, catch up, or, just simple things like that. And so the impetus was that those meetings with Margaret Thatcher and Gorbachev and those guys for the wall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's as I quoted earlier, Shakespeare, Hamlet, there's more to heaven and earth a ratio than I dreamt of in your philosophy. And the longer I live, the more I recognize the wisdom of Shakespeare in saying that. Things that I might have questioned or did question years ago, they may sound bizarre and they may seem strange, and I don't accept them on face value by any stretch, but I don't dismiss them. One of the worst things people can do is have contempt without investigation, and I think, for instance, I had contempt for the idea of spiritual transformation until I was forced in a life or death situation to explore it, and I started investigating it, and my contempt vanished. So. Lots of things happening that more and more will be revealed as time goes on.
Yeah, one other addition I want to add, since you were enamored with the Indian culture and people doing psilocybin and LSDs and such, there is a powder called Haritaki, and I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's only like $11 on Amazon, and if you take a spoonful before you go to bed, put it in liquid or what have you, the dream state is just phenomenal. Mm-hmm. And I think that with your spiritual awareness, you may have a greater experience than, I experienced so many different crazy colors. Mm-hmm. I think it's based off of your level of awareness and how you respond to it.
Yeah.
And in that Indian community, it was one of those. I wish I had known about this a long time ago. I mean, David and I talked about going to Peru for an ayahuasca retreat, and I'm like, this Harataki, and I don't even have to purge myself and go through what happens over there. So, it may be ayahuasca light to an American listening.
Well, Lewis Carroll supposedly wrote his work. You talk about rabbit holes, but Alice in Wonderland on funny mushrooms. So who knows? Who knows what's happening here?
Absolutely. And like you just said, we're encouraged with so much that's happening now, and I think that people will be further encouraged when they read "Piercing the Veil: A Skeptical Journalist Discovers Unseen Worlds." Could you tell people where they could pick that up and how they can get more information from you?
Yes, absolutely. It's available on Amazon, and it's available in ebook form. It's a black and white form, and it's got inside color illustration, so it's a color form as well. So it's available on Amazon. I also have a website, KingsleyGuy.com. That's KingsleyGuy.com, and you can order it from there. That'll take you to Amazon. But there's more information on me and also on the other book I wrote, Queen of the Heavens, which is a novel set in ancient Egypt. But KingsleyGuy.com can get you to Amazon, or you can go directly to Amazon and just put in Kingsley Guy, Piercing the Veil, and it should come up.
Fantastic. Well, you have just been in tune to another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. This is Hamza.
And I am David.
Kingsley, it was a pleasure speaking with you today, and I'd love to stay in touch if we could.
Absolutely. You have my email, I have yours, and appreciate the opportunity to share some of my perspectives with you.
Yes, thanks for being with us. Yeah.
Thanks again for checking out another episode of Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective podcast. Please check us out on our website at intrinsicmotivation.life, where you can click on the Speak Pipe button and leave any suggestions for future podcasts that you'd like us to cover. Also, check us out on our social media sites. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, iTunes podcast, in addition to Stitcher and Google Play, all under Intrinsic Motivation from a Homie's Perspective. Check you out next time. Have a great day.